Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Tom Middleditch. Tom is an autistic ADHD Melbourne-based access and inclusion consultant. He has worked as the inclusion coordinator at St. Martin's Youth, the access officer for the Melbourne International Film Festival, and as a relaxed performance consultant and inclusion dramaturg for many of Melbourne's most prestigious arts events and organizations, including the Malthouse, Melbourne Fringe Festival, and the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. He has a specific interest in Neuro Inclusive design and inclusion as a creative process. Everyone, welcome to our podcast. Today we have the great pleasure of speaking with Tom Middleditch. He's the co-founder of Autistic. Tom, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me. Glad to finally be on the screen and in people's ears.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. But first, for our audience, can you please tell us more about yourself?
Sure. Well, as was said at the top, my name's Tom. I am an autistic and ADHD artist in Melbourne, Australia. But primarily the work I do, related to the topic of the podcast, is in access and inclusion within the arts space. So I work as the inclusion coordinator at a youth theatre, St. Martin's Youth Arts Centre, which is focused on creating work with children for an adult audience. I was also recently the access officer at the Melbourne International Film Festival, which was an interesting journey this year, given when lockdowns were happening was just at the time that we were about to start the festival. So we had that wonderful moment where everyone was in the office and the sixth lockdown, I think it was fifth or sixth, you get to the point where they all just sort of roll together. And when you're in a position of great fortune like myself and you can forget what number lockdown you're in, they just sort of roll together. But at that point, the film festival shifting from going out into the Melbourne winter, standing in line and seeing a very nice movie became stay at home and watch it on the streaming service that we brought in last year. So that was a wonderful thing to get involved with as well. But primarily, most of my experience is in live performance, in theatre and the performative act, if I may indulge such obtuse word use.
Well, I do think, the pandemic itself was a great global experiment for all of us to really also explore or push our boundaries and really see how the digital space could bring more access. It could bring more inequity too. I mean, I think it has two sides of the same conversation, but it really did open up also more access for so many individuals, don't you think?
I absolutely agree. And I think not just in terms of the pragmatic thing of me being in Melbourne and you being in New York, is it? Or
Yeah.
You being in New York and us having this conversation. That was available prior to now through other video conferencing, but it hadn't been normalized socially until about a year or so ago. But I think another thing that the immediate shift to Zoom meetings did was give a boot camp for empathy for autistic people, because suddenly everyone has to question how they're coming across. They're looking at themselves the entire time. The concept of eye contact is gone. How do I indicate focus? Am I doing too much? Am I doing too little? What does this background say about me? Are there too many books? Am I overwhelming people? Oh God, Zoom is exhausting now. I need to have a break. I'm having a break from talking with people. What? Am I that old now? Oh God.
I love that. I think it's just that order.
Yeah. I consider that to be ADHD thinking. The idea of linear thinking is something a lot of people had, it's just a normal in the way that we use the word normal, i.e. that 1950s usage of the word that came in after World War II. That word was, you could think of it as a corporate buzzword in that way, because it was taken from, I think it was a French mathematical or medical system, where the word spent about 100 years. There's a book called Normality, a critical genealogy, which I'm working my way through, and it explores the adoption of the word normal. And if the authors of that book are listening, I apologize. I'm completely butchering the research and the meticulous wordcraft that you put into that with my enthusiasm to make my point. But please go out and find that book and correct me, because I genuinely love being corrected. It's like, free growth, wonderful. Yeah.
But I didn't even know it became like, didn't even think of when did that word become popular to use or normal to use. I didn't even think of that. Yeah.
It's such a fascinating idea because it was brought in the 1950s as a way to create a base level of what society should be now that we've got, a whole world traumatized by World War II, the new kind of existential threat with the nuclear bomb, and the complete annihilation of the old world that for a lot of people who were still alive then was a living memory, was something that they had like their childhood was spent in what we now think of as the old world. And suddenly the 1950s are here and the nuclear family's here and the cars they're going faster now and seatbelts, what are they? So bringing in the word normal created a perfect aspirational goal that no one can achieve, that everyone should strive to. But we didn't really consider what that would do for the entirety of the community. In the same way, we're not really thinking about what mindfulness could do for people who aren't aware of its origins in, Buddhist practice. A lot of mindfulness comes from this idea of ego death, that there is no self, that by becoming in the moment, you simply become a sensing being, which is very convenient if your political motive is to make people think that they are responsible for their emotions rather than their emotions being a response to the world around them.
Wow.
So these are the sort of things I'll just spin out of nowhere. But I do apologize.
This is fascinating. No, this is fascinating because it ties into our conversation, because how did we decide what is normal, right? We came up with our own biases and lived experiences and whatever we thought was normal. And then that community sort of defined a normal for themselves. And then they did, and then they did. And also the media defined the normal, and so we kind of had this like global benchmark on so many things that we had to live up for, right? And like to your point, we did not think how it might promote exclusion, or maybe we did think and didn't care, I don't know, but it definitely did.
I think there's always been a tendency to want to exclude the weird, except when it's profitable. I think there's a meme there's probably have you heard about memes on the internet? There is a meme going around about the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, where you play the song and then you have the idea of capitalism will ostracize the unusual unless it's exploitable. It's like, yes, well point. Done. Thank you for your first year political critical theory on that point. But it is true. So many people's self-worth is graded by their productivity, which, to spin all the way back to the pandemic and going back on Zoom, segue, I'm good at this.
Yes.
So many of my friends, like in the past 20 months, I've had about 20 people come up to me and say, hey, I think I'm ADHD, or hey, I just got diagnosed with ADHD. And I think there's a boom happening now, because what happened when we shifted from being in the work to being at home was that the mental architecture of the workspace, i.e. the way that we measure our productivity, that we scaffold our capacity to deliver all of these things, that was sent home with us. That was sent into our private dwellings.
Yeah.
Now, if you've got the privilege of being able to work remotely, that's not something that you would have concerned yourself about at the time, because at the time it was, March 2020, and we were all going, what on earth is going on? This is history. Oh God. So what happened was, because that mental architecture became our responsibility, a lot of people realized they were not as productive independently as they thought they could be. So this idea of a normal, productive human being, a little chink in the armor there, just that little bit comes out. You see this a lot when women who are undiagnosed ADHD, because like whole slew of reasons, they get to the age where they're having children, and if they've been functional, and I use the word functional even though it's got a lot of ableist underpinnings to it, if they've been functional up to that point, having children puts this extra realm of strain on it. I don't have children myself, so please take the comments I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But caring for children is boring and repetitive and often unrewarding in the moment. Which
very true. I have a 3-year-old, so
Yeah. I mean, there's only so much insight into the human soul and the phenomenal perceptive capacity of the universe to create infinite wisdom and moments of beauty and grace when you're changing a nappy for the third time today.
Or no repeating an answer for like 25 times, or playing the same game over and over and over again. Yes.
Just going out the front into a garden and going, what's that? It's a plant. What's a plant?
Oh,
I'm not
why
qualified.
Is it a plant? Is even
why are they growing? What's that about? Why do they not? And it's like, well, probably because they're not lazy. Plants are good workers. No. So at that point, overwhelm happens and the capacity to function diminishes. And usually that's another key point when people go out and get ADHD diagnoses. But to bring all the way back to COVID specifically, the phenomenon of people going out and getting diagnosed ADHD, I think has coincided with that further like empathy boot camp that we've all gone through by being in these sort of Zoom meetings. Because right now, I think it would be reasonable to say we're having an organic conversation, but there is a certain level of performativity because we're on screen right now. Like I'm specifically sitting in the center, even though the photographer who is, watching this would say, this is a more interesting position to sit in because now we've got all of this space to balance it out. Maybe we might even get a golden ratio going by having this curve coming in here. Ooh, what's that center here? So there's all sorts of things that we can actively consider. YouTubers and Twitch streamers have been doing this for years. That's why there's such a distinction between something like a live esports stream where they're able to cut between everything seamlessly and narrate it. And that one time that I can't remember the exact details, but a public law hearing in America went viral because one of the lawyers accidentally put a cat filter over his face.
My God.
And he genuinely had to make the statement, I am not a cat.
I also saw a potato version of that. Somebody couldn't get out of a potato filter.
The potato, yes, my goodness. Oh, that's wonderful. So
I think it's unfortunate that it takes a global crisis like that for us to kind of get a self-check, or to your point, empathy boot camps, like really getting out of our own comfort zone and testing ourselves in different, I guess, realms, and see how we do or how we may not be able to do, and the fact that it's okay either way, right? But it's unfortunate that it take a crisis, but I really hope we don't get out of that mindset. I do feel the pandemic triggered a bigger conversation around inclusion, and there's also a lot was happening. The murder of George Floyd also triggered a lot of conversations. So, and maybe we as the world heard it more because we were all at our homes and looking at the screen too, right? So maybe our attention span and like what we channeled our energy into was there at the right time. So we actually took it, because this is not a first time conversation in by any means, diversity and inclusion, right? And
No.
I would love to ask you about, I am sure you're having to, or at least I have this very strong assumption that you have to explain yourself or what neurodiversity is over and over and over and over again. And as much as that's great for awareness building, what does that do to the community when you have to really repeat yourself over and over and over again and try to explain yourself?
I understand why people might think it's exhausting, but for me, there's a couple of ways that I approach it. The first is I want to approach it like a stand-up comedian, where they have a point that they want to make and a dramatic arc that they want to have for this bit of information, where ultimately, if you're doing stand-up comedy, the idea is to get a laugh out of people. And I love to be able to do things in a humorous way. But for me, the effective communication of complicated ideas, that's a challenge. That is that is a way to make the day really interesting. Like, the understanding I have of neurodiversity now is it's Australian made, first up. It was coined, I believe, by Judy Singer in the 90s, and it was intended to be aligned with biodiversity, not in the sense of it being a natural, well, I say, I'm going to have a lot of butchering, and Judy, if you're watching this, I apologize. But the idea was biodiversity was invented as a political stance in the 70s to underpin action to defend the ecosystems that were at that point starting to noticeably become unraveled. So the idea was that in order to have a secure ecosystem, you need to encourage biodiversity. And there are a whole slew of reasons behind that. Neurodiversity borrows the same idea, which puts forward the notion that human brains have a natural neurodiversity to them. Now, that's not to say I'm neurodiverse and you're not. That's the first hurdle a lot of people fall down. Technically, everyone is neurodiverse. We all are part of the neurodiversity paradigm. So then what's the use of the word? If it's applied to everyone, what's the use of that word? I would say it's useful in the same way the word human is useful. We still use that, even though technically everyone who is a human would use that word. But what's important with neurodiversity is that it is also a political movement. It's a political statement. It puts forward the idea that there are people who are neurodivergent. Now, what are they diverging from? They are diverging from, and this is where, me wearing a red shirt becomes a little bit more, oh no, oh God, I see where this is going. They are diverging from the ideal brain for a capitalist work system, or if the word capitalism in that context is a bit too scary, for the standard corporate work structure.
And what we called, or the world called, normal.
Yeah. This is why a lot of neurodivergence, like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and on and on and on it goes. These are all discovered in school, because school is the training ground for entering into that workforce. If you are not meeting developmental milestones, those developmental milestones were created, and psychiatrists, please email me and tell me if I'm wrong, because again, free learning. Free, charge me if you want. But basically the idea is that there is a predictable path that a human should follow in order to become an ideal worker. Now, that has changed over the past 50 or 60 years. It used to be factory workers were the ideal person, and then you could, leave school at 14, 15, 16 years old, like my dad did back in 50s and 60s and 70s. But nowadays, knowledge workers are the ones that are most in demand. So the idea of you absolutely have to have a university degree in order to be able to consider starting to work. And it's even more intense in countries with larger populations and even more in-demand knowledge sectors like China and India. Those places, you need a master's degree at minimum in order to get basic secretarial work. It's not necessarily because the work itself is so intellectually rigorous that it requires that. What it is an indication of what we need to award to humans for us to feel that they have accomplished a certain level of development. Now, when we talk about neuro inclusivity, we are acknowledging that people's brains grow and develop in different ways. There's a complicated neuroscience behind it. And personally, I'm really interested in the idea of trying to figure out what the philosophy of that would be. But that's, put that over here into the future where it exists, where I have the time to be able to figure that out. It will probably be based in phenomenology, but who knows? Don't quote me on that. Because they diverge from the expected way people are meant to behave in classrooms, a lot of work is done to make the ways that they diverge appear to be deficits, something wrong, something bad. Now, back in the 60s and 70s, the idea of neurodiversity was very binary. You were either smart or you weren't.
Oh, man.
That was it. That was all it was. So a lot of people who grew up in that time find the various diagnostic labels that are coming out now very confusing and very, why do we need to call it dyscalculia? Just say you're dumb. Just say that thing there. I'm not quite funny enough or charismatic enough just yet to get onto one of those wonderful British panel shows. But if I ever did, the joke I would want to tell would be to ask someone what their first TV was. And then we get to have a wonderful little conversation about, it was one with a knob and the screen would do that slow cooking thing. If you put an egg on top of it, you get told off for putting an egg on the TV, you monster. And the TV that they have now. And then the wonderful surprise is, do you think that TVs will have had that much engineering, but the psychological development of our children would not have?
It's such a good point. It's not funny because it's so true too.
That's my favorite joke. Ha ha, you learned.
But it's so true because it's not that, in like the generations, like for example, even trying to explain it to my mom, right? And she understands the concept and she's a mathematician, like she is a science person, she appreciates science and she would appreciate diagnostics. But she would still, I would say, oh, so that's like different than the normal, whatever that normal she grew up with, right? And that normal, I guess, or what we called normal, even was a more stronger association because we weren't exposed back then, right? That TV that was cooking the egg on top was probably had like single show and with like certain coverage of what the media or TV wanted to show to people. And as much of the like existing vices it has, social media really kind of showed us, well, wait, there are like million normals out there and million different things. And we started to get exposed to that more and more. So it, like, if you're having a conversation with Gen Z, like even I'm a millennial, when I was growing up, you couldn't easily talk about, maybe it's a cultural thing too. I grew up in Turkey and you couldn't even like easily talk about, oh yeah, like I'm seeing a psychotherapist. Like you can't say that as like a breakfast conversation. But now I talk to my cousins, for example, who are like Gen Z, and they're like, yeah, I'm going to therapy. I need to go to therapy. It's like, going out for a walk for them. And the they have much more appreciation towards things that can help to them mentally, how they might be different, either neurologically or another like physical ability or not. And that's their normal, right? Because they already were exposed to many different things like growing up. So we are actually, it's kind of like the ability to be exposed to things really defined things that were not necessarily like fact-based, scientific, nothing. We just made things up based on our like own exposure, seems like. No.
I think you can see a lot of this in the prevalence of personality tests right now. Well, there's been the boom of personality tests since, Jung put forward his ideas all the way back in the past. And particularly, I mean, we always hear about the Myers-Briggs, and then the more common thing now is to hear about, Myers-Briggs wasn't made by a scientist. It was made by a mother and a daughter, because the mother was trying to figure out why she didn't like the man that her daughter had brought home. And then you get wonderful points for being snarky, and then have a conversation about, well, we can believe what women have to say about these sort of things, and on the conversation goes and on the clicks go. But the important thing there is not that Myers-Briggs is not based in rigorous science. Right. The important thing is that we, like humans, are labeling things. Humans love definitions. One of the biggest arguments that was had on the internet is this dress blue or white? Is a hot dog a taco? Is The Martian a comedy? Like, these are the debates that we're always going to be having. And it's not just so daytime radio has something else they can talk about. It's because humans are constantly discovering new ways to perceive the world around them and draw even finer lines. I'm just going to vogue out for a second there. Even finer lines between what they thought things were, and suddenly they've discovered, actually, this one thing is multiple things in there. I'm conscious that I've done a lot of faffing, and perhaps not as much meat and potatoes conversation around the work that I actually do. So I want to take the car of this conversation and just jeer it off, and hopefully we're not
They're
following
all connected.
Everything's connected. That's the joy of it. Suddenly discovering, we knew where we were going all along.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, there is. Oh goodness! Now I've completely forgotten. I veered so hard.
No, but so you wanted to connect it. So obviously, like, we're talking about, I guess, sort of like the problems that we've been seeing, and even like the word normal being one of the problems, right? And how that can like trigger various different things. And you're approaching inclusion through arts, right? But also with art, the enabler and the communication means at the same time to achieve inclusion. And so, well, you are an artist, but I'm going to ask, why arts?
Because it's the thing I can do. Like, and end of the day, when I was in, I feel like one of those. Let me just spin off the story now. You got to tell them a story that's completely unrelated, like that. I can't do the whole Simpsons quote, but at the end of the day, it's usually the small bits of validation that can guide your entire life. Like when I was in year 7 and we did a French test and a Chinese test, I got higher on the Chinese, and I ended up doing 6 years of learning Chinese just on that one test. And I think the reason that I'm with art was because art is something where, when you see the pragmatic effects, like the real world changes that it can cause, those are wonderful. Those are, they fly in the face of anyone who thinks of art purely as a hobby, as a nice thing to do when you're not at work. When I was in university, maybe around 4th or 5th year, because it took me a while, I went to the student theatre that was there, which, unlike a lot of student theatres in Australia, was funded by the student union and had 2 full-time professional theatre staff there curating an entire season of work that was made by the students. Very, very good program, and I believe it's still going there. I talked with the head of student theatre to say, hey, I wanted to do something for the O Show, which was an introductory show for the new university students who were coming in, a sort of comedy spoof of what university life would be like. And at the time, I had led no major theatrical projects. So in my head, I'm thinking, oh, this is fine. I'll just be able to do a couple of jokes. But the head of student theatre, in her infinite wisdom, was like, that's quite a lot of work that's going there. What if you did something more related to Asperger's at the time, or like autism? What's that for you? And at the time, the DSM-5, with the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, had just gone through its 5th iteration, which there's a whole history of why that's interesting. But the thing that was interesting to me was that the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, which is what I had originally been diagnosed with, was folded in under the label of autism spectrum disorder. Now, at the time, there was this fear that a lot of people's identities had been wrapped up in Asperger's syndrome. So with it being removed as a medical thing, what was going to happen? Would it be like homosexuality, where it exists obviously outside of a medical context, and the removal of it from DSM was a destigmatization of queerness? Or would it be one of those situations where it fell into the realm of indigo children, spiritualist sayings that operate more on instinct and the co-option of cultures outside of one's own? We didn't know, so we created a play called Them Aspies. The name was deliberately provocative to try and create the idea of, if you're upset by that name, why? Because most of the Aspergic, now autistic people are not othered in that way unless they are. And basically the idea of the play was to create a sort of sketch comedy where about halfway through the sketches stopped being funny and started being serious. And we achieved it. The whole thing wasn't funny. No.
But I'm sure it was.
But to trail it all the way back to the main point, a number of people after seeing that play came up to me and said, I got diagnosed because this play showed me that. Now, I don't want to claim credit for creating, such a way. It was a devised piece, so it was a collective effort.
But I think please claim credit.
No, it's not my way. I think the important thing there is that the reason I'm reluctant to claim credit is because there is a dearth of diagnostic identity. The reason that we have so many personality quizzes out there is because people want identity. They want somebody to tell them, this is how you operate and these are the ways to do it. Because forming an identity on your own is incredibly difficult. It's laborious. It's hard. And you can only, theoretically, you can do it all life long, but probably by the time you hit 40 or 50, you're done. You don't want to have to think about who you are anymore. You've got children to deal with. You've got neighbors to, argue over the fence and the passion fruit vine. You've got workspaces with the car park that you always want, but it's always full no matter how early you get there. Is that car just living there? Does that car have an owner? What's in that car? So at a certain point,
the
youth are always trying to find identity through experience. And those beyond that are trying to find the identity of others. They're trying to have new experiences because they know who they are. So of course they get annoyed when young people go to the new thing and, look at all of these labels, and aren't millennials just absolutely horrible because they've got all these names for themselves, and don't they know that they're just putting themselves in boxes, and there's more to human life than can be understood in that way. And a lot of the time, no, people are still trying to figure out who they are at a basic level. You need to grow from a box in order to get rid of the box.
Or we grow out of one and we get into another one. Like the life stages also kind of changes how you want to identify yourself too, right? Or could change, not necessarily always, but it's interesting because in the end, we're social animals, right? And maybe that's why we also like being part of clubs. And maybe we are tired off of one club and we want to join another one. Or when you're single, you want to hang out with single friends. But when you're married, maybe you have more couple friends. And maybe when you have kids, you have families with children as your friends. Maybe we just can't continuously evolve also in like how we identify ourselves. And those life stages are completely okay when you see them again and again and again and again. But then again, going back to like what we were saying in like exposure, when something is new or unknown, suddenly to your point, like in us loving identifying things or even like grouping, putting the adjectives, right? When something is unfamiliar, it's kind of, ooh, like what's going on there? I guess my question on that, and I would love to get your perspective on it too. I sometimes feel, when we're in conversations, and this happens a lot around like inclusion, like when we're talking about, let's say, inclusive design, and then there is this like, oh yeah, like this is for people with disabilities, right? There's like big bucket, which like who knows what that means, right? And then, but if you also like go about and say, a person with X, like something very specific, that also can come off as othering. But if we're lumping people into this like big major bucket, like I'm Turkish American and I once met an American person. I'm not going to give out which region it was in US to not like create any impression about the people there. But when I like basically said like, I'm like Turkish, the reaction was like, I respect that, which I don't even know what that means still to this day. And so like her view of the world was like US and non-US, like all other nationalities I don't know or care, like kind of that attitude. So when I say with like disabilities and whether or not that's a disability or is it a disability, that's a whole other conversation. It's creating that bucket of like us putting a group of people that we don't understand or haven't been exposed to before somewhere else. But is that worse, or really repeating something like maybe a diagnosis or whatever, as if it's like other? Is that more of a problem? Just would you love your thoughts on that? Sorry, it was as rambling as I'm asking, but
the way that I've been talking has been encouraging of rambling. This is an ADHD conversation. We go where the interest lies, which a lot of people can find that frustrating because they're thinking, get to the point. What's the takeaway? Where's the dot point that I can go for? To which I have to be one of those frustrating white people that goes, no, it's about the journey. It's not, the destination just means the journey's over.
Well, I'm clearly enjoying this. So
well, it's my goal to be entertaining. It's a conscious thing that I want to do. But it's also, I think, a thing that I do because being autistic and ADHD, I have a lower threshold of idea forming to idea being said out loud. Now, my partner has a better version of that where she'll go, I thought of a piece of clothing. I'm going to make that piece of clothing. That's a much better, in my opinion, that's a much better. Oh, yeah, it's fantastic. It's like, oh, I've got all of these silks. I'll just make all of my friends silk gowns. And everyone's like, no, what? I've got a silk gown now. Oh, God. My version of that is, I thought of this pun literally a second ago. I don't even know if it's a pun. And now I've said it. It's not a pun. Oh, well. So the trick of it is sometimes I just say things wrong, but if I say it compellingly and if I say it entertainingly, then right or wrong could be determined afterwards. I'm not here to, tell you what is or is not fact. What I'm here to do is try and, present an idea of how to have this conversation around inclusion in the neurodiverse space. Because unlike with architecture you can see. it's physically there. You can go out and you can touch it, and you can point to the ways that, the angle of this ramp here and the step-free access allows for this amount of stress onto this sort of thing, and these materials allow for carbon capture and the support of this or that. Neurodiversity is being political, also philosophical, therefore artistic. It's a lot harder to objectively present it once you go outside of the psychiatric scientific space. So, for example, there's a big drive at the moment, particularly in Australia, to hire autistic people, because there are, a percentage of the population. I think that the average percentage of the diagnosed autistic population that is either unemployed, underemployed, or looking for work is about 4 or 5 times higher than the average rate of unemployment in normal people in the exact same situation, which is obviously unacceptable, because there's a lot of stuff we can do. I'm entertaining here, and I'm sure people can do lots of other things. But what's happened at the moment is that the stereotypes of autism are informing how people imagine they can work. So the primary way that autistic people are being employed right now is in IT. It's in technology. Now, don't get me wrong, autistic people generally, as a stereotype, are good with that. The issue, I think, is that the stereotype that's being used to bring them in, hardworking, loyal, quiet, diligent, got their own way of doing things. These sound like the stereotypes that were used in the 80s to hire Japanese people. It's the exact same stereotype, just translated for a, less racially motivated hiring strategy. But the strategy is still the same.
Similar.
And that's that's because the stereotype of autistic people is automaton whose natural talents are not a result of personal vindication or veracity of interest, but just like a machine. That's just what they do. It's not a quality. It's not a virtue. It's just what they do. Now, that's obviously dehumanizing in the way that anything that is said to be just something people do is dehumanizing. But what's properly dehumanizing is that it means that the idea of autistic art to a lot of people sounds like an oxymoron, sounds unimaginable. But neurodivergent people have been making art forever and will probably continue to. We can't help it. It's a new thing. I've had an idea that needs to get out into the world. Is this a pun?
Yeah.
No. Okay. So making art spaces neuro inclusive is really important to me, because a lot of the art spaces are run on the idea of social equality. But the way socialization works within art spaces, ironically, is very unexamined. We'll examine how a rehearsal structure is creating a aesthetic of a work. We'll examine how audiences respond to things. We'll even go so far as to examine the physical access, the communication access for things like Auslan, Australian Sign Language. But to go further than that is hard, because there's not a physical pragmatic thing and not a measurable thing. Now, part of my mission has been to try and make measurable things that can be shown to people, to say, hey, here's a measurable thing we can do. This is a relaxed performance. A relaxed performance creates a socially inclusive performance space that allows for the role of audience to be challenged, that allows for those who experience sensory processing disorders to not have to go through hell and high water to watch a play. It understands that art makes emotional demands on human beings, and that's what it's meant to do. But just because that's what it's meant to do, in the same way that surgery is meant to save someone's life, that does not mean a person bears full responsibility for managing themselves. We use anesthetic, we inform people of the risks, we let people know what will happen if they don't do that.
Right.
Obviously, I'm not saying relaxed performance is the equivalent to coronary bypass, but the basic idea is still there. We are meeting people halfway.
Right.
Now, you need to have an understanding of neurodiversity in order to understand what it is that meeting halfway actually means. And I think this is something that a lot of millennials, particularly growing up in the online forums of Tumblr and 4chan, have done in completely different ways, I would say. Like 4chan was specifically, 4chan understands how content warnings work, because the idea with 4chan is to be offensive. And then with only the offensive people left. So the offensive people had to offend the offensive people. And then eventually they all got bored and became friends and formed political parties. And oh goodness, that's a whole thing. Tumblr went the other way, where content warnings and intersectionality became a badge of worth, of indicating your capacity to empathize and understand how the various ways human beings exist. But one thing that they did really, really well was creating the idea of content warnings. Now, I tend to opt for, when I'm working with organizations, I offer content warnings over trigger warnings, because trigger warning to me is a top shelf medical term that should be used to indicate that a person has been triggered for, like, their PTSD has been triggered. And PTSD can come from, various things, war, post-maternal trauma, sexual assault, physical violence, things where your brain is triggered to go to fight, flight, freeze. Yeah. I think flirt is also another one, but that's another thing. Anyway, the point of it is you are triggered into a space that is viscerally uncomfortable and potentially dangerous, and you need therapy in order to get through that. I think there's been a co-opting of the term triggering to be any emotion you didn't expect. Technically, if you're at a cafe and happy birthday starts getting sung at another table, that's triggering. You didn't want to hear happy birthday. You don't know what your role is there. What are you meant to do? Do you join in? Do you just sort of sit there and go, oh, it's somebody's birthday. I hope they're old. But content warning has the added value of going, we understand this content to have as an intended goal an impact on human beings. We also understand that we cannot anticipate what people's triggers are going to be. Some people could be triggered by the smell of brie cheese. Is that silly? Depends how you present it. Is it a trigger for the person whom it is a trigger for? Absolutely. You cannot warn for the smell of brie cheese. That's unreasonable. There's no way you could do that. So you have to present like an ingredients list. These are the elements that we have brought into this performance piece. You, as an informed consumer, as an informed citizen, now understand the risk you are taking on and can decide for yourself whether or not this is something that you wish to absorb to make part of your lived experience.
Which only seems fair. I mean, when we make the analogy of food ingredients, it's like, yeah, of course, like, obviously, what if you have allergies, right? Like, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's a thing that people are still anxious about, particularly within art spaces, because a lot of people feel that telling people what's in it takes away from it. Now, you can quote the scientific studies that say actually people who have had something spoiled enjoy the thing more because they're able to put aside the part of their brain that's trying to anticipate where it's going to go and can just enjoy, the human interaction and the genre and the production design and all that. But artists are not comforted by that. So most artists are not comforted by that, nor should they be. They've put a lot of work into creating a surprise for people. So instead, you have to make it about choice.
Yeah.
You have to make it about choosing to bring your audience with you.
Yeah. And do you think that's a notion that artists, because I experienced this in the design world, right? Like our studio, for example, we're very strongly saying that we need to say design with and not design for, because even though, you may not be implying that, but for example, in a conversation, you wouldn't say, I'm going to speak for you, right? If you intend to really have a dialogue with the other person, it would be a speak with or have a conversation with. So design for, even though that's not, you might intend by saying that, but it could imply I'm going to design on your behalf and I don't necessarily care about your point of view, even though you're the main user, right? So like it's important, like what we use in our own language and how we express ourselves too. But I think a lot of that still doesn't sit well with designers, not all designers, but some, because it's perceived that it's maybe diminishing for the profession, right? Like there's certain, I don't want to say dumbing down the profession, but no, we're the experts. Like, so we do it, right? I don't know, maybe it's ego, maybe it's what they were used to all this time in the design world. But do you see that also have like kind of coming up in the art space too, where but like I'm the artist. This is it's my domain, it's my ownership. I should get to decide.
Personally, I have not encountered that, but I absolutely am aware of it. I think people only really talk to me when they are either questioning that part of themselves or have questioned that part of themselves and want to involve me in those sort of processes, because I'm confronting in that way. But I think the reason that people feel that this sort of examination is diminishing is because they have not examined what of themselves they are expressing in that work. And in expressing self, if they haven't interrogated the idea of what it means to be human, they might have a very monolithic idea of what the human experience is.
Right.
When people talk about, human design or designing for all humans, humans is not a monolith. Humans is not one thing. There are many, many diversities of that particular, kind of thing. Now, we're still trying to understand what that means, the full extent of how many different kinds of humans there are, and trying to work to what works best for as many humans as possible. Speak specifically to relaxed performance. I think the differentiation I make between access and inclusion within an art space is that access happens at the end of a rehearsal period. You've got a product, you've got this play, this thing, this entity that you want to show to people, but there are a few gaps, a few barriers to getting people to be able to see it. You got your classical things like your physical access. Can people actually go there? Is it wheelchair accessible? Are the seats accessible? That sort of thing. You've got your next level, which is your communication access. Is it understandable in terms of language? Do they need to have audio description? Does it need to be, do you need to have an Auslan translator? Do you need to translate the language that's being used? Then relaxed performance exists in a new category, which I'm stealing this term from a VCA academic, aesthetic access, where conceptually we understand aesthetic access. If you go into a blaring club, the point of a club is to have that overwhelm. But if you go into a random room and it's a blaring club, that room is inaccessible sensorially.
Right.
So understanding the sensory impact, the aesthetic impact of your work on an audience is the main project of creating relaxed performance settings. But in order to do that, there's various things that you have to do. So you got your product, you got your play. I keep saying product, so it's a box sort of thing. Here we go. Here's play. Enjoy play. Did you like play? 1 out of 10. Would you play again? So you've got your performance, and it's got lots of things. It's very nice. It's a good performance. Wow, you did that yourself? Well, the team, that's still pretty good. You've got your lighting, your sound, your narrative. You've got your actors. Maybe some of them are famous. Maybe some of them are recognized. These are all elements within the piece. You need to have an understanding of how all of these things impact people. And I think that a lot of artists still think of access in the physical objective way, rather than an amendment to the work that they're doing, which is why people feel concerned about it. They want to know that their artistic work, the work they've put a lot of work into, is going to be received as they intended. But as they intended implies everyone's brain absorbs information in the exact same way. This is why
Right.
theatre can be seen as very elitist or exclusive, because it often fails to understand, or maybe it absolutely understands and makes a key feature of it, that not everyone is going to be able to intellectually access a performance in the way that it might need to be in order to be maximally enjoyed. A lot of people feel alienated by theatre because of this idea of the bar conversation afterwards, where I didn't get it. I didn't understand this or that. And I know we all say that, art is subjective, everyone's opinion, as long as you can present your points. But, everyone's equal, but some are more equal than others. And I'm sure you've had a conversation with art where you've put forward an idea and somebody said, well, that's obviously wrong because you didn't consider this and this and this and this and this and this and this. And the idea of more points coming together to cohere makes their point more compelling. And at the end of the day, art is just about the experience that you have with it. Everything else is, discussion afterwards. But it's making that specifically accessible. And most pieces of art, if they stick to just endpoint thing, it'd be the equivalent of me taking a Murakami book and saying, this is a really, really good book, giving it to you. And I know that, let's say, for example, you have a vision impairment, so I give you glasses, but it's in Japanese. So you need to have it translated. You need to have it be made aesthetically accessible.
Right.
That's where inclusion comes in arts. It's about making the rehearsal process, the creation process.
Creation inclusive.
Yeah. Empathetic for the experience of as many human beings as you want, as you can make it. Now, this, I think, is the real challenge, because that's where we really need to break down the norms. This is where we get to have wonderful words like dramaturgy, which I'm sure if you've ever come across the word dramaturgy before, you ask 10 dramaturgs what it means, you'll get 25 different definitions. But
what's your definition?
My definition is dramaturgy is the know-it-all's know-it-all within theatre. It's the person who works to understand as many elements of a piece as they can to inform the creative process so that it can be more coherent. Now, there are various different types of dramaturg. You can have new work dramaturg, which just sits with a script and works through classical structures or new structures, or looks at the avant-gardeness of a particular work. Rehearsal dramaturgy, we are actually in the space with humans who exist and have persons like experiences that, inform how they are. And as professional as any artist can be, they at a point have always brought their experience into the room, and often that experience is why they are in the room. So how do you get people to work together coherently in that way? And it's a rehearsal dramaturgy that I'm interested in, because autistic people socialize differently, not worse, differently. We focus on objective details first, because objective details anchor us in the world. They are things you can track and trace and pull and hold to as anchors within reality. So a lot of the time, to diverge just a slight bit, autistic empathy, again, it sounds like an oxymoron, but I promise you it isn't. Autistic empathy is where you get really specific about what it is you're empathizing with. Take the standard idea of an empathetic exchange. Let's say you've told me something. I want to make sure that I have indicated to you that I've heard, that I've understood, and that I can feel what you feel. So generally, you might do that by the performance of empathy. So yeah, I understand that. That sounds really hard. That sounds difficult. I'm sorry I've had to go through that. Autistic empathy would be like, I know exactly what you mean. This is an experience that I had that I can cite that indicates to you, I know exactly what you are going through right now. I can comfort you by showing you an experience that you have also had. Now, without that context, it can sound like the autistic person is just making the conversation about themselves, which, in social situations can be quite alienating. And that's just one of various ways that autistic people talk, interact differently. And it's in these unexamined things that autistic people tend to not be able to get into the room or even into the audition space. But it's that is really, really interesting for art. I personally think inclusive rehearsal structures are, by their definition, avant-garde. Because avant-garde, big fancy $10, $15 word, just means ahead of the curve, something that hasn't been done yet. You bring in people that have never been in a rehearsal room before, and you work with what they can do that's made them unable to go into that rehearsal room, you're going to make something new. That's avant-garde by definition, by basic fundamental inclusion. It is imperative for any artist who wants to be doing work that is new and cutting edge to bring in the people who are not making the art, or to empower the people who have not made art in that place at this time.
100%. And I often experience this, like my friends who have different physical abilities or ADHD, generally they're either the best ideation partners in design ideation sessions, and they're the ones that come up with the best ideas to really think of something in a different way, because they just had to continuously hack their environments throughout their lives. So their lived experiences are as equally important as a professionally trained, let's say, industrial designer or an architect, because that ideation session suddenly becomes so much more meaningful and innovative, really, to your point. And I think especially in arts, where I think and all the industries kind of are looking upon art to really break the norms and be the edge and push the boundary, so that that can trickle down into our other spaces, right? Because like if it's like you can't censor art, right? If you start censoring art, then what does that mean to everything else in our society? So art has to be the avant-garde and the innovation space. So and to your point, then it only makes sense that it is inclusive of everyone that either like didn't have a chance to participate in art before, or just like have that collaborative creation of what that might look like, because we don't necessarily have that in any other industry. Like we have very small examples of it, right? Like new case studies, really. It's like handful of things that are actually inclusively designed. I'm not talking about accessible, and like baseline accessibility is not necessarily inclusion. It's like, telling we have a diverse society or like a workforce if you have like one Black person employed. It's something like that. I think all the accessibility regulations are very much like baseline at the moment. It doesn't necessarily mean inclusion. So in that way, I really I have so much appreciation for what you do, in the sense that like art has to be the space that is pushing boundaries. And I honestly can't think of any other way for it to be then inclusive of all, in order to be able to do that. And bringing kind of like a system of how that might happen through like Autistic, I think that's the genius of this, which is why we're doing this podcast, right? Because I didn't know like there could be a framework or a starting point to be able to achieve this. Because to your point, when we say neurodiversity, this goes back to our conversation about bucket or single diagnosis. We're talking about a very diverse group. Even like when we say autism, it's a very diverse group, right? So to me, it's like infinite combinations almost. Like you can have so many new innovations just by collaborating with people with autism, because it's such a diverse group on its own.
Absolutely.
That's all I feel about this conversation. Yeah.
It's a good totality. It's a good summary. It's a good totality. I think one thing I will say here, and I do this not to be like, gotcha, but just to illustrate a point, is language around neurodiversity is like in any deaf, disability, neurodivergence experience, always evolving and always updating, particularly since neurodiversity only became a term in the early to mid 90s, possibly late 80s, but it only really became popularized in the the 2010s, which means it is a political movement that is 30 years old. Now, we know, like, the idea of what a woman has been known for thousands of years. The idea of different racial groups has been known for thousands of years. Contemporary feminism has been going for 100, 150 years. Basically, there are a lot of civil rights movements that have been happening in the past 100, 150 years. Neurodiversity has had 30 years, and we still don't have an objective thing of what an autistic person is. So it is a really difficult thing to be able to interrogate. But to the point I wanted to make was that the language that is used at the moment to talk about autism is very emotionally charged, because it seems really, really simple. You get the dichotomy of autistic person with autism. Personally, I think person with autism sounds they're with Jesus now. They're with God. They're sort of like that sort of extremity of it is a separate thing. It is a tumor. It is a pair of glasses that can be removed with the right vitamins. And it implies the idea that there is a normal human underneath all that autism that we can just sort of carve out, which has led to an incredible number of really abusive therapies, right? Like even today, there are some places in America that still use electroshock collars on intellectually disabled adults as a means of coercion and control. In 2021, its current year argument. But that is not necessarily to say that everyone who uses the language with autism is a bad person. That's absolutely not the case. More often, it's not having the language to understand or empathize or accept that autism is not a pair of glasses. It's the whole neurology. Because if I was to ask you, point to where on my body the autism is, we'd be here for a while. Or maybe we'd be here for no time at all, because the obvious ludicrousness of the question is apparent. Autism is, you can't see it in a photo. You can maybe see it in a GIF. You can definitely see it in a movie or a TV series or a live performance. And you can see it in the people around you.
Interesting.
But it's not an it. My favorite way of talking about this is that neurodivergences are genres of human being. There are tropes and stereotypes and general thematic consistencies that if you hear somebody is autistic, then you can engage the part of your brain that, okay, I have these sort of things that I associate with that sort of, experience. But when you meet the person, they're their own person. Yeah. There's a saying, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Because we are all completely different, like everyone else. We are just like everyone else, only different, only not. And that sort of nebulousness is really, really difficult. But I tend to opt for the identity first language, which autistic person. That's the genre of human that I am. That is the way.
I like that. And it's interesting because I read about this and talked about it with a few people before. And I've heard both, right? I've heard people saying, I prefer people first language. So like person with, because they found the other way around would be prioritizing something about themselves that is, they already see a part of themselves. So why am I prioritizing that? It's kind of like maybe introducing myself as I'm the blue-eyed girl. Like, why does that come first? But I also see your point, because why do we have to say with something as if that is kind of like, to your point, like with Jesus or whatever. But I think in the end, what matters is this dialogue, right? Like understanding what even language can mean to the other person and all the implications that it might have, right? Like how it makes you perceive yourself. Are you going to end up in years of therapy because of it? Like all of that. And the fact that this should be an open dialogue and not making assumption about any autistic person or a person with autism, whichever they may prefer, because culturally that might also change, right? So like you might culturally find rude to have adjective in front of your kind of identity, which is the human, but you might also feel like no, it sounds like an attachment. Like I have this like baggage that I need to carry around. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So, and I think this is like in itself a great example of the more reason why we need to understand, right? And meet and collaborate and expose ourselves with autistic people, or however you want to call yourself, I guess, to people that are listening to this, and include that in a way where you talked about like aesthetic inclusion, right? And I think these differences for like, you know, in somebody who's working at a creative studio, it's fascinating for us, right? Because like we love to kind of like think and rethink and push ourselves to like think again, right? No design is final. It's just another iteration of a prototype version. So how can we do better? But I think we have to understand this throughout, like in non-creative fields too. I think there's more conversation, right? Like I'm seeing more and more, even in like healthcare forms where you don't necessarily have to opt into female or male only, right? Like we're kind of making our box a bit bigger very slowly, but we see that in these very archaic industries as well, like a little bit. And I do rely on arts to push that, to be the gateway of that. And I really appreciate that there's even this like conversation while you're creating content of an art piece that it could be inclusive in a more sensorial or aesthetic way. And also like in this case, even like the language itself too. But yeah, I mean, I guess in short, I'm a fan. We can like wrap it like that. But I think to your point and how you started the conversation in terms of like, you know, describing arts because of the impact that it can make. And I definitely agree. In a very direct way, like a person can actually come up to you and say, like, after this show, I got a diagnosis, or in a very indirect way, really trickling down its impact into many other industries or like fields. For us to really have an inclusive mindset all around. And the more inclusive mindsets we have, the more this will be common norm anyway, or the new normal. We'll call it normal again.
Coming back normal, growing back normal, all of these wonderful terms that come to define something. I do love the use of the word let's normalize. It's something you see a lot on Twitter and this sort of thing. It's like, let's normalize. And sometimes it's a really serious thing, or sometimes it's a jokey thing. But the idea of democratizing normal to the point that the word normal doesn't need to be applied, because the assumption is that, you know, normal is the unachievable perfect, which is this wonderful little contradiction that everyone's like, yeah, I totally understand that. Let's just go along with it. But when normality is questioned in that way, like that crisis moment, this is where you have this sort of this time where you can actually reflect. If you're fortunate enough to be able to have that freedom and space to reflect in that way. And I think that's what art does for a lot of people. Like, as an artist, you give yourself the space to question all of these things in the creation of a work and the creation of an art piece and this sort of stuff. But then the people who, you know, work 9 to 5, 8 to 6, 24/7, 365, invent new calendars and timelines to be able to indicate how they're working, they only get hour, half hour, maybe 3 hours if they're watching Lord of the Rings again. They only get that time to involve themselves in art, to involve themselves in a space where anything can happen, where the imagination is set free, where dreams are shared pragmatically. And I think it's every artist owes it to themselves to consider what it is objectively they're bringing into the world. Because yes, art is about expression, but it requires another person to be expressed to. It requires another
point.
person to receive, to internalize, and to comprehend.
It needs an audience.
Yeah,
it needs communicate with an audience.
Yeah. It needs that to happen there. And
such a good point.
There are tendencies and there are trends with the way people want to be able to empathize, or the sorts of things that they are willing to empathize with, or different trends in genres. But at the end of the day, this is a craftspeople's chance to create something that imparts an experience that the viewer decides if it is art or not. This is why I find the label of artist really, really interesting, because I can't say everything I do is art. It might become art if people absorb it and treat it as art, in the same way that I'm only as smart and witty as you are able to attribute those values to me. I could just be talking complete nonsense, and I'm sure people will have varying responses to how I've presented myself today. All of them are right for them.
Right.
That's the art of understanding other human beings.
Oh, I love this so much. It's such a good way to like kind of slowly wrap our episode. But before we do, I want to ask maybe more of a quick question on this one. But what would be your advice to maybe an autistic person, maybe not, somebody going into a field and want to make change, be the avant-garde, push boundaries? What would be your advice to them?
Optimism is a learned behavior. Humans, by biological necessity, look for the threat, for the danger, for the bad in order to become accommodating. That's why the news is always about snippets of bad things, because that's what attracts humans, but it's also what maintains their attention. They give you slivers of bits of information that you need to attend to, and are always ultimately the worst thing that's ever happened. And now there's another worst thing that's ever happened. And oh, puppy! And there are now worse things that's ever happened. But particularly within the arts space and with the culture spaces and the entertainment spaces, optimism is a learned behavior. It's the long run. We have to be in it for the long game. It's frustrating, particularly for myself as an ADHD person who, as soon as they think of a change, they want the change to exist always, forever, always, already. But optimism is a learned behavior, and you need to give yourself the space to be patient as you can be. Or maybe I'm completely wrong, and impatience is what is serving you your energy to be able to change things. I mean, no peaceful protest where, you know, that was completely out of the way, somebody sitting in a cafe holding a sign saying, "Hello, let's talk," was ever really considered successful. You got to be disruptive in that way. But ultimately, I feel like I'm spiraling here, but I will.
No, but you're saying use your patience or impatience to be optimistic.
Yeah, optimism is a learned behavior. You have to practice it. You have to engage in it. And it's not foolish. It's not immature to be optimistic. It is a conscious effort. It is a choice. It is a belief that things can change to be better. That's a learned behavior. And I think everyone can learn it.
Tom, this was such a treat. I feel like we could have this ADHD conversation for a day long.
I'd have to take some breaks at points, because I need a third coffee by now to keep going, because eventually I'll just say the same things over and over.
This is like big ideation session, right? Like I think no wonder people with ADHD like thrive in ideation sessions, because it's just like boom, 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 like so much good content in such a short period of time. But this was amazing. Thank you so much. Anything that you would like to add, share, updates, announcements we should know about, or should we just follow Autistic and see what's next?
I think just following Autistic will be the best course of action. We have a website, we have a Twitter page, we have a Facebook account. I personally have taken myself off of social media as an independent person, but I can be contacted through all of those various channels. But yeah, just keep an eye on keep an eye on the neurodivergent art that's in your area, because we're in Melbourne, Australia. We respond to the Melbourne Australian situation. The neurodivergent people where you are, and I'm talking to you, the listener, right now, where you are right now, they are doing the work that matters to where you are right now. So find them. Go out. Go and find them.
Wonderful. Tom, thank you so much. Thanks for making the time. It was lovely speaking with you.
Thank you for having me.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.